Good morning, everyone. The time is 9:30 and I shall resume this inquiry into the appeal made by Dignity Funerals Limited against the decision of Doncaster Council to refuse planning permission for a crematorium, including memorial gardens, car parking, a new vehicle access onto Green Lane and ancillary works at land south of Green Lane, Brodsworth, Doncaster. And this is the second day of the inquiry. Can I just check that everyone can see and hear me okay? Brilliant. So just the usual reminders to switch off mobile phones or turn them to silent. And in terms of the attendance sheet, can I ask the council to send through yesterday's attendance sheet to Robert, please, if it's possible?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sure somebody from the council will be listening in the background who can send that through.
Brilliant. And obviously, if we could keep an attendance sheet for today, that would be useful.
Yes, ma'am.
So we aim to break for lunch around 1 p.m. and hopefully finish by 5 p.m. today with suitable breaks mid-morning and mid-afternoon. And I'll ask the advocate's view in terms of appropriate timings for those. So on the first day, I heard opening statements from the main parties and a statement from the joint rural parishes. It was agreed that statement be sent through to the case officer, which it has. I've asked for that to be forwarded to the parties. The council's landscape witness, Ms. Oxley, gave evidence in chief, and Mr. Village commenced cross-examination of Ms. Oxley. That cross-examination will resume shortly, followed by any questions that I may have and re-examination by Mr. Robson. I will then hear from Mr. Taylor on landscape matters. And with a fair wind, we may even start the evidence of Mr. Kirkpatrick, but we'll need to see how we get on. I had a quick look at the timetable yesterday. Obviously, we're not where we'd hoped to be, but I'm going to keep it under review, and hopefully we can see where we're at the end of the week, and I'll send around a recirculated sort of timetable to see if we need those extra day or hopefully not 2 days. So just before I get started, just to double check that everyone is here. We're not waiting for anybody else. Seems everyone's here. Does anyone else wish to speak today who's not already indicated that they wish to do so? No. Are there any procedural or housekeeping matters that we need to tend to?
Just yes, one thing from us, Mum. We haven't actually received anything from the joint parishes yet, so we're looking forward to receiving that as soon as possible, please.
It landed in my inbox yesterday, so we'll ask the case officer to circulate that round to the parties. That should be with you hopefully soon. Mr. Village, we're just waiting for you to have a look at the site visit itinerary. So if that, I'm assuming that's in hand today. So if you just keep us posted on that. I don't want to delay things, just, wanted to get started. A couple of things I wanted to check though. The recording of yesterday's event, is that on the council's YouTube channel? Just, for interested parties who may wish to view it. I couldn't see it, but if the council could maybe just check that for me. I think it's important just for, members of the public who are interested to be able to see it fairly readily after the close of the inquiry, given it's not being live streamed.
Yes, ma'am. Particularly yesterday, as the joint parishes, who I know there was wide interest in their submissions. Mr. Hildersley is listening in, who's helping to organise the event. So hopefully he will have this in hand and we'll be getting it uploaded soon, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much. Just briefly, I was thinking last night about the timetable and how to make best use of inquiry time. It seems to me that one of the main issues is the availability of advocates. I had suggested slotting in conditions, just to fill a gap, maybe to avoid cross-examination continuing overnight. But sort of thinking out loud, which is always dangerous, I wonder whether advocates would need to be involved in those discussions on conditions, or whether, obviously, presumably those have been checked before being sent through and agreed by the parties. Having had a look through, the conditions are fairly straightforward, I would suggest. So I just wonder whether, if we could park the conditions, we may find a slot to deal with those. I'm thinking, if we do keep on track with the timetable, which is not looking optimistic at this point, but if we do, then there could be potential, maybe it's Friday morning, to deal with those just between the, with the planning witnesses, maybe it's a solicitor if you wanted the solicitor's involvement, and that's maybe something we can keep up our sleeve. But make the best use of inquiry time and advocates' time by just keeping going with the main evidence. So if you could just bear that in mind, have a think about that, and maybe return to that at the end of the day. It would rely on me travelling on the Thursday night to get down to Doncaster on the Friday, and then we could maybe hear conditions. I'd have to tether my phone to get an internet connection to do the sort of virtual roundtable hearing session on the Friday morning, but it may depend on other witnesses and how far they are travelling to the site visit. So I'm just putting that out there. If the parties could have a think about that, and just see how we get on and keep that under review. But that may be something to keep up our sleeves. So I'm not necessarily wanting views on that at the moment, but it's just something you can think about. Are there any other procedural points before we resume? Okay, then, Mr. Village, would you like to recommence your cross-examination of Ms. Oxley?
Thank you, Mum. Just on that last point, though, we would entirely be supportive of that idea of yours. Seems a very eminently sensible one. I mean, generally speaking, I don't get involved in condition section. I'm kept well away from meddling in that. So
it's very sensible.
Yeah, we go along with that one. Good. Okay. Good morning, Miss Oxley. Now, I think we hadn't quite finished, I'm afraid, with the fit for purpose LUC report to the council on the planning applications. And I just want to go to the conclusion section, please. And 3.20, clearly these are the conclusions of LUC on the applications, where it says it's difficult to directly compare the findings of the three LVAs as the effects are reported in different ways. However, none of the LVAs conclude that adverse effects would be of greater than minor importance, except in the case of the construction effects at Armthorpe Lane, although the other LVAs do not separately assess construction effects. All three LVAs conclude that the woodland and landscape proposals associated with the developments would be beneficial to the landscape and visual amenity to some degree, albeit it would take some considerable time for planting to mature in practice. Now, the point to note there is that there was no dissent. Effectively, there was acceptance of that point by LUC in relation to this application, wasn't there?
Yes, insofar as you know, insofar as we understood those impacts from the documentation provided.
Yes, from the documentation provided, which you've had, and from the site visit which was undertaken.
Yes.
Yeah, and then, and bearing in mind always bearing in mind that this document was, and you endorse it as being fit for purpose. Correct?
Yes, fit for purpose, but again, a review, not an assessment in itself.
But fit for purpose, what purpose? The determination of whether the planning permission should be granted or not in landscape and visual impact terms.
No, that wasn't its purpose. Its purpose was to review the appraisals. It wasn't to advise on whether the planning application should be refused, because that's very much the role of the planning department in balancing up the effects against the benefits.
But you knew that it was going to be used for that purpose, didn't you? That was the purpose. It was going to feed into the decision-making process, wasn't it?
I'm sure it was used for discussions, but those weren't discussions that we were party to.
No, come on, Miss Oxley, you can do better than that and be more helpful as an expert witness. You knew it was going to feed in to the decision-making process, didn't you?
I'm afraid we didn't. We knew that it would be used maybe to ask the applicant for further information, maybe to feed into the decision-making process. We were quite remote from what was actually going on. There wasn't a discussion about whether or not the application should be refused on the basis of landscape and visual effects. When we undertake these sorts of reviews, it's often because the council may wish to go back to the applicant and ask for additional information. And you know, there are a variety of purposes. It wasn't particularly about whether, I mean, of course, that's part of it, but it wasn't, we weren't included in those discussions.
Miss Oxley, what you just said is wrong, and you know it must be wrong. It's untrue what you've just said. Just look at paragraph 1.1 of the document itself. Doncaster Council are in receipt of 3 separate applications for crematoria as detailed in table 1.1. As part of their approach to determining the 3 applications, the council appointed LUC to carry out a review of the landscape and visual supporting material submitted with each application. So you knew what the purpose of this document was, didn't you? And you stated it there in 1.1.
The council could also have taken the document and decided to ask the applicant for further information, and indeed that is often the case if we highlight omissions within reviews. So we weren't party to the next steps. Our commission ceased at the point that we submitted this review. So I'm sorry, I can't really help you.
Well, Ms. Oxley, I'm afraid this goes to your credibility now as an expert witness. You know, and the point I made to you, you know very well the purpose of this document, and indeed you stated it very clearly in the first paragraph of it, didn't you? Well, it was to assist in the determination of these 3 applications, wasn't it?
It was to help the council understand if the LVA that was submitted was complete and fit for purpose, or whether they should ask for additional information. Are you
not willing to answer my question directly, or are you simply deliberately being evasive?
I'm not. I'm just, you know, that was what our brief was.
Well, shall I put the point again to you, and perhaps you can give a clear answer? Shall I?
Sorry, I don't quite know what you mean. Do you want to repeat that?
Yeah, I'll say, shall I put the point again and you can give a clear answer to it?
Yeah.
You knew what the purpose of this document was. It was to assist the council in the determination of the planning applications, wasn't it?
that's the end game, yes, but
Yes.
there was, you know, another aspect to it, which was to see whether the assessment was complete and if further information should have been provided.
Well, I think we've got there in the end. Yes, the purpose of it, and it was fit for purpose, you told us yesterday, the purpose of it was to assist the council in the determination of the planning applications. Correct, isn't it? That's correct.
Yes.
Yes. You see, in a previous life, I was a dentist.
And the relevance of that.
Right. So going back to the conclusion, we see 320, and you agree with that, what's stated there. And in relation to 322, Green Lane is in Greenbelt land, but benefits most from existing woodland, with views into the site and across the surrounding landscape being limited to gate field access points within the existing hedgerow. Again, you agree with that conclusion, don't you?
Yes, and it's reflected in my own visual assessment on page 26 of my proof.
Thank you very much. Right, now let's move on to, you can put that document away, probably not too far, you may have to come back to it if necessary, depending on other questions. But could you turn to your proof of evidence, please, at 1.20. And also take up the report to committee.
Mr. Village, what was that second document you referred to?
The planning committee report, ma'am, which is document A6.
Thank you.
And paragraph 1.20, you say the evidence supports the council's reason for refusal, that the proposal represents inappropriate development in the green belt for which very special circumstances have not been demonstrated. The proposal is therefore contrary to Doncaster Course Strategy Policy CS3, Doncaster UDP policies ENV2 and ENV3, and paragraphs 143 to 145 of the NPPF 2019. Now, I think there was subsequently a change to the terms of the refusal notice, and that change can be seen in the council's Rule 6 statement. But which seems to have mislaid at the moment. But anyway, it's not absolutely necessary for present purposes. So here it is. And and the change is identified in paragraph 18 of the Council's Rule 6 statement, which states the appellant's statement correctly points out that safe policy ENV2 was incorrectly referred to on the decision notice. The policy relates to countryside outside the green belt. Now, I mean, effectively, the relevant policy for the purposes of this reason for refusal was, well, the policies were CS3, so Core Strategy 3 of the May 2012 document, and ENV3 of the UDP. That's right, isn't it?
You'll need to put those things to the planning witness, I'm afraid.
Well,
I didn't go through.
You're quoting them, so I'm putting them to you. If you saying you simply don't know what those policies say, or you aren't aware of them, then that may be the case. But you've quoted them, and I was
aware of the change, but I'm not aware of the detail. So
right, okay.
So
you are. I'm sorry. Did you say you are aware of the change?
I was aware that one of the policies was altered. So you're not asking the right person about policy, I'm afraid.
I'm not going to go into the details of the policy with you, no. And then it goes on to say the Plan Committee report states, and quote paragraph 9.100, however, issues in relation to landscape visual impact and the impact of the openness of the greenbelt have not been overcome, although the impact on openness is minor. Great weight must be attached to it as set out in the framework paragraph 144. Would you turn up paragraph 9.100, please, of the committee report, Miss Oxley? And that says, in conclusion of the environmental issues, it's considered that issues in relation to trees, ecology, landscaping, highways, air and pollution have been overcome, subject to suitably worded conditions. However, issues in relation to landscape visual impact and the impact of the openness of the greenbelt have not been overcome. Although the impact on openness is minor, great weight must be attached to it, C144. This weighs against the proposal carrying substantial weight. Overall, therefore, the proposal is considered to balance negatively in relation to environmental matters. Now, Miss Oxley, could you tell me, please, why you left out the first sentence in 9.100 when you quoted it in, or purported to quote from that paragraph in your proof of evidence?
If I did, it was completely an oversight. I think I quoted from the reason for refusal statement
No.
In the decision A5.
No, you're quoting in 1.20 from the Planning Committee report. I took you to the quote and I read out what you had said. And I'm asking you why you left out, why you omitted the first sentence of 9.100.
Give me a second to read it. I just quoted the relevant part of the sentence. But
no, you left out the first sentence of 9.100, which tells us that that among other things, issues in relation to landscaping have been overcome subject to suitably worded conditions. The very issue upon which you profess expertise, landscaping,
no,
has
discussion about landscape and visual impact, not landscaping.
Well, no, you make criticism in your proof of evidence about the type of landscaping that is used, and it is stated very clearly in the reports committee, endorsed by the members, that landscaping issues have been overcome, can be dealt with by condition. And you've deliberately chosen to leave that sentence out, and I just wondered why.
I was just trying to make my proof of evidence not too long. There was no deliberate omission. Those words are there in full in the relevant documentation anyway. So,
well, you see, it's strange, isn't it, that you leave out a sentence which identifies very clearly that the council are not concerned about issues of landscaping. They feel that those issues have been overcome subject to the provision of conditions. And yet you go on in your proof of evidence to criticise aspects of the landscaping. For example, non-native species used.
yeah, I comment that some aspects of the landscaping, such as the non-native species and the large areas of hard surfacing, are quite suburban, urban fringe type features that you might find in a Tesco car park or something.
Well, you don't actually refer to Tesco car parks in your proof of evidence, but in commenting in that respect, that some of the landscaping is in your view out of character or unacceptable, you're departing from the views of the authority in relation to landscaping, aren't you?
I know that the urban designer had commented on the building.
You see, part of the problem for an advocate, Miss Oxley, about giving time estimates is that you have to assume that there's going to be some cooperation from the witness in answering the question that's asked. I didn't ask anything about the building. We're going to come on to that, actually, funny enough, in a moment. But at this stage, I'm asking about landscaping, not what the urban designer said about the building.
Do you want to take me to the relevant consultation response and then?
No, I'm looking at what the officer said about landscaping, and I'm asking you why you left out that sentence. You say, well, you didn't want to make your proof of evidence too long. And I said, well, in that case, you go on to critique or make criticism of the landscaping used. And you said yes, because some of it's like a Tesco car park. And then I said, well, you're departing from what the council officer said, weren't you? You were departing from their view about the acceptability of the landscaping. Well, I'd like an answer to that question now, please.
Are you talking about the planting, or are you talking about the hard surfacing and the retaining walls and the pond and such like? Just so I'm clear, because landscaping can mean a plethora of things.
It does. It's a wide. Sorry.
I'm talking about the whole thing. I'm talking about the feel of it. You know, the fact, and I commend the tree planting proposals, any tree planting proposals these days are, you know, a very good thing. But there are also aspects of the landscaping which are more suburban or urban fringe in character. And I'm talking about planting there. You know, similarly, the surfacing used, there's a lot of concrete paving. There's a lot of retaining structures, a lot of asphalt. I'm commenting on these in terms of impact on or fit with character, really, in a rural landscape, because they are more urban features in a rural landscape, which is quite detached from settlement. So it is a high quality landscape scheme. There's, you know, but it's not, it doesn't fit with the local environment in entirety. Of course, the native trees around the periphery and the hedgerows do, and are positive aspects, as the applicant has described.
What's the answer to my question, please?
Why did I leave the sentence out?
No, we moved on from that.
The relevant part. I'm talking about landscape and visual impacts. The landscaping is part of the impact, but I didn't feel the need to quote another 4 lines. There's no deliberate or malicious omission, believe me. Quite flabbergasted to think that that's the case, really.
The landscaping was found to be acceptable by the council, and I'm asking you, simply putting it to you, that you are departing from what the council viewed to be the acceptability of the landscaping in making your observations about it being more like a Tesco car park. That's what I'm putting to you. And I'd like you to either acknowledge, yes, you are departing from what they said, or no, you're not departing from what they said. So which is it, please?
I just think that term is used in a really loose way. I mean, what does it mean? If yes, I am departing if I'm considering the development as a whole. Are they talking about the tree proposals there, or are they talking about, I don't know what they're talking about. You know, landscaping can mean everything. It could be the whole development, or it could just be the planting. But I do note that the plants aren't all native, and that's just a factual comment.
Ms. Oxley, I'm sure you've been involved in many applications for approval of reserve matters relating to landscaping, and landscaping, as you rightly said, can be covers a wide variety of things, which would be including hard surfaces, planting, and ornamental lakes and so on. Now, the council said that they believe that issue could be overcome by condition, didn't they?
They did, yes.
You're, though, departing from their acceptance of the acceptability of the landscaping, aren't you?
Well, I remain of the opinion those things can be addressed through condition.
Fine. So there isn't, therefore, any issue in relation to landscaping if the matter can be addressed by conditions.
It would be a somewhat fundamental departure from the proposals that are conveyed in the landscape master plan if all the hard surfacing were to be removed, for example. You know, if that all became grassland or wildflower, that would be less suburban, wouldn't it? But it would be a very different scheme than the one that's before us. So I'm commenting on the scheme that's before me and the detail that's provided, and there is a lot of detail on the landscape plans, not just the landscape master plan, but a whole series of detail sheets and plant schedules as well. So are you suggesting that the applicant is going to amend all of that or just part of it? in order to satisfy conditions.
Miss Oxley, I'm asking questions of you because, first of all, you've failed to acknowledge in your proof of evidence what the council believe, your client believes is acceptable, namely landscaping, that issue has been overcome and can be dealt with by condition. You then told the inspector a moment ago, well, actually, you remain of the view that landscaping can be dealt with by condition. But now you seem to be saying that, in fact, it would represent too fundamental a departure from the original scheme for it to be dealt with by condition. So where are you now? Could you perhaps just reflect on the answers you've given, and knowing that we're here ultimately, believe it or not, to help the inspector, would you like to tell her whether or not you have a fundamental point about the landscaping, or whether you accept, as did the council, that landscaping was resolved subject to the imposition of conditions? Which is it, please?
Aspects like species mix are relatively easy to amend. The shape and extent of hard surfacing less so, because it's fundamentally linked to the design of the building. The inclusion of a pond, for example, which is not part of the character of the area, again, is probably a fundamental part of the proposal. I think the retaining walls are a fundamental part of the proposal. I couldn't see how the design could be altered through condition to amend those aspects.
So,
and I'm not sure in this paragraph whether the council is talking about all of those things or just about the planting.
It's referring to landscaping. It doesn't make a distinction. And if you had any doubt about it, you could have asked them. Did you?
I didn't ask them, no.
So simply taking the words at face value, the council say that they believe that landscaping is something that can be dealt with by condition. They're happy that the issue has been overcome, subject to conditions. You choose to ignore that comment in the report committee, and have embarked on a detailed adverse critique of the landscaping proposals. That's really where we are. Does that remain your position? I just want to know where we stand with, as opposed to what the council say and what you say. So you are departing and coming back to a point which I thought, frankly, was a very straightforward issue, one way or the other, when I started asking these questions now about 18 minutes ago. You're departing. You're departing from.
I think the heart of
Sorry,
this
let me.
is the context, isn't it? We
Madam,
can see this is high quality landscaping. There would be a lot of money.
Miss Oxley, sorry, I just need to interrupt. I did ask Mr. Village yesterday to be polite and to let you finish speaking. So if you could do the same for Mr. Village, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Miss Oxley, is it the position that you are departing from what the council say, that landscaping is overcome subject to imposition of conditions, or are you accepting now what their position is, namely that landscaping has indeed been overcome subject to imposition of conditions? Which is it? You can't have it both ways.
I'm not departing.
Right.
But I do want to say that landscape and visual impacts are all about whether what's proposed is right in the context. And the document F9 KB to Aldwick Limestone Plateau section on page 57, for example, gives a whole plethora of guidance about what's appropriate in the landscape. So use characteristic local materials. Not saying a huge amount, but if we also look at F10, again, there's guidance, but it's around, you know, local vernacular, appropriate planting, these sorts of things. These are the kind of things that affect character. You can build a beautiful building with really beautiful landscaping in a location where it doesn't fit because it doesn't respect the character of that place. So the landscaping, you know, it's high quality, but does it fit and does it result in an impact? Those are the sorts of things I'm trying to consider.
I've noted, and I will be corrected by my learned friend if I'm wrong, that you accept and you don't depart from what the council says in the first sentence of paragraph 9.100. And if I've got that wrong, he'll tell me now, and I'll have to continue this cross-examination, this line of cross-examination. But that's my note of what you've just said, that you don't depart from it. Right, I think we can now move on. By the way,
Ma'am, just to be clear,
Mr. Willis, just hold on there, Mr. Robson.
I don't think you are going to be corrected, and I don't think there's any need to go back to it. I think my answer in my note was that she's not departing from what was put in Ms. Oxley's not departing from what was said in 9.100. I think there is a disagreement about what Ms. Oxley thinks is meant by 9.100 and what Mr. Village thinks is meant by 9.100. I think the answers have been given in that respect, and I'm not sure there's any need to continue. But of course, that is for my learned friend to decide. That would certainly be the basis on which I may re-examine or take the matter further.
Okay, thank you. It's noted, Mr. Robson. Mr. Village, are we moving on now?
We're moving on. Incidentally, madam, of course, you'll know that what I think is neither here nor there, and indeed what Mr. Robson thinks is neither here nor there. We're just barristers. We don't have any original thoughts of our own. We simply represent the views of our clients.
Fully agreed. A slip of my tongue. Thank you, Mr. Village.
Right, now, can we turn to the issue of what the building looks like? Because, I mean, this is an area where you have a go as well in criticising the proposal, 3.17. Second bullet point, I judge that these moderate adverse effects at the LLCA 1 scale will relate to the following. Bullet point 2, the introduction of a development which is suburban or urban fringe in character, including a building which is intended to make a design statement rather than respecting the local context and traditional vernacular. The design and materials of the building would appear out of place with other rural buildings in the local countryside, and its curving shape and oval design will not be typical or reflect the local vernacular. And there are other references of similar points made dotted through your proof of evidence, where you refer to it as an alien form, see 3.14, and also at 1.22 and paragraph 2.4. Could you again turn to the report committee, please, Miss Oxley? .62. The design and appearance of the building has been designed taking into account its countryside location. The proposed crematorium building has been sited to nestle into the existing landform, Generally, the building has been designed to make a sculptural statement within the landscape. Its curved plan form with simple elliptical flat roofs are set within the surrounding undulating ground with a backdrop of woodland to the west and south. It's proposed that stone-filled gabion walls are used to address the various level changes within the site and define the boundaries of the arrival space. The elliptical flat roof to the crematorium is designed to visually float above the perimeter walls through the introduction of frameless clerestory glazing. It is proposed that the main roof of the building, which will be visible from the elevated approach road, will have a green roof. The height of the underside of the eaves is approximately 4.5 metres from finished floor level within the building. External louvres are located above the central roof light to provide solar shading and a potential location for photovoltaic panels. The chimney to the cremator will rise approximately 1.8 metres above the main roof level, and it goes on that will be, the chimney will be clad in pre-patinated zinc, and then it goes on at 9.64. The council's urban design officer has provided guidance and advice throughout the pre-application process and has been consulted with the subsequent application, commenting that the design of this proposal seems well considered in relation to the surrounding landscape setting and could result in a good quality development which is sensitive to context and attractive in its own right. The officer is therefore satisfied with the scheme subject to conditions relating to final materials, details of a hard and soft landscaping scheme to be agreed, and 10% renewable energy requirement. And it then goes on to say, as such, the proposed redevelopment is therefore considered to meet with policy CS14 and the framework. And CS14 is a policy relating to design and sustainable construction, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm muted. I believe so, yes.
Yes. Right. Now, in relation to that part of the officer's report, you don't refer to it at all in your proof of evidence, do you?
I don't know.
No. Do you disagree with it?
I disagree in some respects. So I think the design is interesting and considered, etc. But
sorry, I missed that.
It seems to conflict with the guidance that's provided in the landscape character assessment about respecting the local vernacular and fit with rural character and such like.
Miss Oxley, if you could just repeat the beginning of that. The sound quality wasn't great on there. So
I mean, it's not up to me to make a judgment on a building because I'm a landscape architect, not an architect. But I agree that the building design looks interesting. It's not, you know, it's not a ubiquitous shed, whatever. But I consider that there should be questions raised about whether it fits with the landscape character of the area, which is completely rural. You know, it is very different from what you would find in a rural environment.
Miss Oxley, the urban design officer commented, so someone who is actually qualified to comment on design matters, and you fairly say that you aren't, says that the design of this proposal seems well considered in relation to the surrounding landscape setting and could result in a good quality development which is sensitive to context and attractive in its own right. Do you disagree with that?
I find elements of that somewhat surprising, but maybe I'm more of a traditionalist. You know, I would expect something that would fit better in a rural environment and more closely follow the guidance provided in F9 and F10 on accommodating buildings in the landscape.
Well, I mean, let's take materials, for example. Would you accept that traditional local materials are being used or proposed to be used in the development?
Concrete, render, gabions? Not really, no. There's an element of limestone being used to fill gabions.
Okay. So you take the view, therefore, that the council were incorrect in concluding that the development was acceptable in design and appearance terms.
There's a conflict with the guidance which is provided on page 57, albeit this is for housing because it didn't consider guidance for crematoriums. No. Use characteristic local materials such as limestone with red pantile roofs near the older villages, blah, blah, blah. So these, in character terms, it's a very different thing from what you would expect to find in a rural environment.
Well, it is blah, blah, blah in relation to that because that relates to residential development. I'll put to you again, second time, that the council were incorrect in relation to its acceptance of the proposal in design and appearance terms. Is that right?
Again, the council seems to be commenting on the design. They like the design, but are they fully considering the landscape character? So yes, I am departing a little from what the council are saying there, but I'm not an architect and therefore I don't really want to comment on the building. I'm thinking of the character of the whole thing again, you know, the character of the car parking, the character of the landscaping and what that does in a rural environment, which is basically, you know, it's a very simple set of elements. It's a big agricultural field, woodland, hedgerows.
Mm. Members of the committee were shown a visualisation of the proposal at Appendix 2 of the reports committee, weren't they?
Yes, I haven't printed off the end of that, but I believe it's the same one as in the design and access statement.
And so anyway, you disagree with the council's urban design officer about the acceptability of the proposal, right?
I say it's out of character in landscape terms.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't disagree that it could be a high quality building of sculptural interest and other elements of his commentary.
Right. So you disagree that it's well considered in relation to the surrounding landscape setting, do you?
There are elements of that I disagree with, yes.
Well, what elements of that do you disagree with? It's one statement. You disagree with the whole statement, I think, don't you?
If we look at the development as a whole, I disagree that it fits well the landscape character of the rural environment that is the receiving landscape.
Okay. And you therefore would suggest the council were wrong to conclude that it did not offend policy CS14.
Again, you know, I think you should discuss that with the planning witness who considers that policy in whole. But my advice to the council would be that this doesn't fit with the guidance provided in the landscape character assessment. It's not of rural character.
Well, the council conclude. I mean, there is a policy in relation to landscape. Are you saying that you simply don't? You're not prepared to sully your hands by referring to any policy document at all?
I haven't gone through the policies in the level of detail that the council witness has, so to ask her.
Are the council now saying, through you, that this is a proposal which is contrary to policy CS14?
No, I don't think so. This is just part of the things I need to consider when I look at impact of landscape character. You know, that I would always have to look at what the character assessment guidance says in terms of what's appropriate in that landscape, what it might say about whether buildings are appropriate. That's part of the things I need to consider as a landscape architect looking at the impact of a proposal.
So the position remains, Miss Oxley, that the council does not suggest that the proposal is contrary to CS14. Notwithstanding your evidence, they still do not suggest it's contrary to policy CS14, do they?
I'm not going to answer that question because I think Andrea should answer it. It's a planning question.
Well, it is a planning question in a sense, but one which relates to your area of expertise. I haven't seen anything in any of the proofs of evidence or the council's Rule 6 statement which says that, in fact, the proposal is contrary to policy CS14. Am I wrong about that?
I don't know.
Well, have you seen those?
I don't know those statements in detail. I don't know what further commentary they provide. Please ask the planning witness about the policy, not me.
Have you seen anything? Have you seen anything which suggests it's contrary to CS14?
Mr. Village, can I just bring Mr. Robson in there, please?
Ma'am, I hope I might save some inquiry time and say the council is not running a case on a breach of policy CS14, and that's been the case since the officer report through the statement of case and into the proofs of evidence. CS14 is a design policy.
Yeah, indeed. So there we have it. So, notwithstanding your comments, the council doesn't run a case based on CS14, do they?
No.
And as such, notwithstanding your comments, the position remains, paragraph 9.66 of the officer's report, the proposed redevelopment is considered to meet with policy CS14 and the NPPF. That's right, isn't it?
Insofar as I know, yes.
Thank you. And thank you very much indeed, Mr. Robson, for that helpful intervention. I think your hand is still up. Just as a matter of interest, could you just turn to the landscape master plan included in Mr. Kirkpatrick's appendices? It's about 4 pages from the end. It's Appendix F. The reference to the lake, which you refer to in your own proof of evidence, Miss Oxley, is that the ornamental pond, which effectively separates the car parking from the main crematorium building?
Yes.
And sorry, just to be clear, that's what you describe as a lake, isn't it?
I've called this a lake, yes.
Yes. Somewhat of an exaggeration, a lake?
Maybe 20, 30 metres across, I think, looking at the scale of it. So
is it an exaggeration?
Between a pond and a lake, perhaps.
Sorry?
Something between a pond and a lake.
Brodsworth Hall.
I think it's about 25 metres across.
Brodsworth Hall, if I may. Paragraph 3.25 of your proof of evidence. People visiting Brodsworth Hall and Gardens. You say filtered views to the site would be afforded to visitors of Brodsworth Hall and Gardens, with views available towards the proposed access road on the site's sloping ground. The appellant's LVA states that there are potentially some views of the proposed access road, Memorial Gardens and the northern part of the car park from the upper floors of Brodsworth Hall. However, this statement is misleading, as views, albeit filtered in places, are also available from the ground floor, first floor, roof terrace above, the porch and the parkland itself. See photographs 3.1 and 3.2. And then you provide two photograph viewpoints over the page in your proof of evidence. Could you take up, please, the LVA? And if you turn to (9.2.9) of the LVA. It says ground level views towards the proposed development from Brodsworth Hall Parkland to the northwest would be substantially filtered and enclosed by intervening trees, both within the parkland alongside the A1M. There are potentially some views of the proposed access road, Memorial Gardens and the northern part of the car park from the upper floors of Brodsworth Hall, obtained at a distance of over 2 kilometres. The proposed native trees associated with these features and areas would be perceived as an extension to Stane Hill Plantation. Views towards the crematorium building and the main part of the car park would be completely enclosed by Stane Hill Plantation. The overall magnitude of visual change for visitors is, and its parkland, would be very low or negligible at year 1 and 10. Now, you criticised the LVA as being misleading, and you've quoted the bit which you say is misleading in italics in your paragraph 3.25. The reason you say it's misleading is because you say that views, albeit filtered in places, are available from the ground floor. I mean, the first of all, the first floor, roof terrace above the porch, and the parkland itself. I mean, first of all, so far as the first floor is concerned, that's not misleading, because the LVA says that there would be potentially some views of the proposed access road, Memorial Gardens and northern part of the car park from the upper floors. And the upper floors include the first floor, don't they?
They do, yes.
So that's not misleading, is it?
No. I'm not sure why it says potentially, because obviously there will be.
Well, potentially, because it depends on whether it's it will depend on whether it's winter or summer. But
See it at both times of year because you can see it quite clearly in the summer.
But the LVA makes it clear that filtered views, it says, ground level views towards the proposed development would be substantially filtered. So there would be views, but they would be substantially filtered. That's what it says, isn't it?
Yes, it says that.
Yes, yes. But that's precisely what you say. I mean, it's not misleading at all. I mean, you yourself say filtered views to the site would be afforded to visitors at Brodsworth Hall and Gardens with views available towards the proposed access road on the site's sloping ground. Why is it misleading?
There are a series of photographs included in one of the appendices to the proof, which are effectively intended to demonstrate that the site won't be visible from Brodsworth.
No, but you say the statement is misleading. You're not referring to any photographs yet. You're referring to the written text. This statement, you say, is misleading. Why is that statement misleading?
It feels when you read the document in its entirety as if emphasis is being given to visibility of the building. But you're right, it does recognise that there will be visibility of the access road. And indeed, when you stand on site, you can very clearly see the hall, which means the hall could very clearly see the access road.
Mr. Kirkpatrick is very concerned about the use of the word misleading. Would you like to, on reflection, withdraw it?
I just think it's quite straightforward. There is a view of the access road and the entrance.
The statement wasn't misleading, was it?
Mr. Kirkpatrick goes on in his proof of evidence at paragraph 6.1.8 to say that he adjusts his assessment to negligible.
Yeah. Let's just stay with this.
Following the work associated with this appeal, but
let's stay with this.
It isn't negligible. There will be an impact, and I have assessed that impact as slight adverse.
If you finish,
the application site is clearly visible from parts of the hall, including some of the grounds, the summer house, the building itself. It doesn't necessarily matter that you can't see the building, because again, we're looking at the impact of the development as a whole.
If you've finished, would you like to answer the question?
Can you say the question again, please?
Yes. That you say that the statement he made was misleading. It wasn't misleading because, as you now accept, he acknowledges that there will be filtered views afforded to visitors at Brodsworth Hall Parkland, but they will be substantially filtered at ground level. So he hasn't been misleading at all, has he?
But I would be happier if he moved the word potential, because there are clear views. There's no potentially, you know, there are definitely views, not potentially views. And I viewed it in summer, so I viewed it when the trees, and that was late summer as well, so the trees were, you know, at their densest. But, you know, ultimately we both agree that the impact is slight, albeit that your witness has since taken that down to negligible.
No, you're confusing two different things. Your criticism of it being misleading was not because of the use of the word potential. You say, however, this statement is misleading as views, albeit filtered in places, are also available from the ground floor, first floor, roof terrace above the porch and from the parkland itself. So it's not the use of the word potential that irks you and why you say it's misleading. It's because you were suggesting to the inspector it was misleading because there are in fact views from the ground floor, from the parkland, and he acknowledges that in the LVA.
He does acknowledge it to a degree.
Okay.
When I read the LVA, I expected to go to Brodsworth and the site to be more or less invisible. And when I arrived at Brodsworth, saw it wasn't more or less invisible. I was a bit surprised. I expected to see nothing. So again, that's from the reading of the whole rather than the reading of the partial. But in any event, we agree that those impacts are slight.
Mr. Village, sorry to interrupt the cross-examination. I'm not entirely sure where this is heading and how helpful it is to the inquiry. I think Miss Oxley has attempted to answer your question, albeit in a qualified way, which is entitled to do. Is it possible to move on, or do you have
No, I've just got one further point in relation to this. I'm sorry, madam, but you will understand that accusations from one professional witness that another witness is being misleading should be taken seriously, and it's right for me to raise those points because the serious allegation that a professional witness is seeking to mislead the inquiry.
I appreciate that, Mr. Village. I think Miss Oxley's attempt to answer it in a qualified way to the best of her ability.
Miss Oxley, if you turn please back to the landscape master plan in Appendix F. To the west of the site, of course, we see a hedgerow, don't we?
Yes.
And it's part of the mitigation proposals that hedgerow will be enhanced and retained and enhanced, and that it will be allowed to grow higher in order to screen the access road. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, but it won't screen that upper part of the field unless it's 20 metres high. That upper part of the field is elevated. That top part of the slope, and that's the part of the site that you see.
Just give me a moment, please. So going back to the landscape master plan, we can see that, that there is a woodland copse in the northern part of the appeal site.
A proposed copse, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, on the lower ground.
And you're saying that the road would still be seen through that copse, would you?
It's on the lower ground, isn't it? So the upper part of the site remains exposed. It's in that lower corner.
Yeah, in that corner where it bends round, that will not be seen. In about what 15-20 years time, I suppose, when that becomes woodland. Yeah, but in the intervening period it would be seen. And what sort of trees are being used in that location?
Do you want me to go to the planting plan?
Well, yes. I mean, do you happen to know? I mean, what are they? Extra heavy standard?
It just describes it as proposed woodland buffer.
Yeah, it will be dealt with. There is. Again, it's a matter for condition, isn't it? But I'm instructed that the proposed trees will be planted in that location as extra heavy standard. Do you know what average height those have?
I'd be very surprised if you planted a block of woodland as extra heavy standard, because that wouldn't be what any landscape architect would advise. You normally plant your avenues and your specimens as extra heavies, which have a height when they go in of approximately 2.5 to 3.5 meters, depending on the species. If you're planting a block of woodland like that, though, you'd put it in as transplants and whips, which are typically 600 to 800, so a meter, maybe 1.5 meters. Whips being, young plants.
Sorry, what did you say that the extra heavy standard size planting is? Just give me that again.
Well, an extra heavy will depend on the species, but and it's usually specified in terms of the girth rather than the height, but it might be 2.5 meters.
2.5 meters.
But they're quite thin, they look like, again, Tesco car park lollipop trees if you plant like that, which is why it's always better to plant smaller plants, because they grow in a more vigorous and more natural looking appearance then.
And what, in terms of the woodland buffer, just give me a second. I mean, we disagree with you about the size of the height of extra heavy standard trees. In terms of woodland planting, that is planted at about 2.5 meters, 2.25 to 2.5 meters in height. What's your understanding of the growth of that planting per year?
You're asking complex questions, but if you plant trees as extra heavies, they don't like being moved. They tend to sit and sulk for a long time, which is why, in places like car parks and golf courses, you see these lollipop trees which look very unhappy and they don't really put on much growth. If they do well and the soils are good, then they might grow 0.5 meter a year. If you plant smaller stock, then it tends to get away quicker and grow better. But again, it depends on the soils, how it's looked after, the underlying geology. This area is underlined by thin bedded limestone, so it's relatively thin soils, but it's been tilled for agriculture, so I imagine the trees will grow reasonably well. But there are many different things to consider. There's no simple answer in terms of tree growth.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask Mr. Kirkpatrick to respond to the detail of the sizes of the trees. We take issue with your understanding of what is the height of an extra heavy standard and the height of woodland planting. Thank you very much indeed. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Village. Just bear with me, Ms. Oxley. I do have a couple of questions. We just hold on. Okay. Ms. Oxley, you were asked yesterday by Mr. Village whether your proof of evidence assessed the effect of the proposal on the green belt, and you said no, in the sense that you haven't categorised that harm as sort of moderate or slight, etc. But that your evidence on landscape and visual effects kind of informed the consideration. There does appear, however, to be a number of places in your proof of evidence where you do actually comment on greenbelt harm at paragraph 1.21. For example, where you state proposals considered to cause some harm to the openness, landscape character, etc. And there are other references, including in your summary and conclusions at paragraph 4.1 and 4.4, in that you state you do not agree that the development of the proposed crematorium would not result in a significant permanent loss of openness within the green belt. And paragraph 4.4, where you state the proposal proposed development would result in adverse effects on greenbelt openness, etc. So I was just slightly confused yesterday in terms of your response, because there are, you do, so at paragraph 4.4, you do say, in my opinion, so presumably that's your professional opinion as to the effect of the proposal on the greenbelt. Could you just clarify your position on that for me, please?
All I was saying yesterday is that I don't give it a grade, so I comment on the effect on openness, and as you say, I do that in several places, because that will inform an understanding of impact on greenbelt, but I don't seek to classify it as major, moderate or minor in the way that I would landscape effects.
Okay, thank you. And you don't seek to qualify the sort of degree of harm, if you like. Are you prepared to do so? Were I to ask that question?
You're asking me to give a grade to it?
I'm asking if you're prepared to do so.
It very much depends on the context and the scale against you're looking at it against. So, you know, the green belt in the context of that particular field, obviously the impact is much greater, and as soon as you step further afield into the wider study area, then the relative impact diminishes. I think that's probably about as far as I can go, though, in terms of trying to put any sort of grading on it.
Okay, would you say the degree of harm, whether the effect on the spatial aspects of openness are the same as the effect on the visual aspect of openness, or is there a distinction there?
Obviously, the visual components are the ones that diminish the spatial component, the sort of physical change to the site and to the character remains, and every change to an area within the green belt matters because it all adds up to make the whole.
Okay, thank you. I won't push you further on that one. Just turning to table 1, underneath paragraph 3.20, page 21. Do you have the page? In that table, you differentiate between the site level landscape effects and the landscape effect at LLCA1. Just in terms of the site level effects, your judgment is that the landscape effects would be major adverse at construction, moderate adverse in year 1, and will remain moderate adverse in year 10, despite maturing planting. Can you just expand on why that's the case and why the effects would not diminish over time?
Purely because of the change to the character of the site, primarily through the hard surfacing and more urban components, because the road will be there forever. The hard surfacing, car parking, retaining structures, chain modification to landform and such like will be there forever. So it's a permanent alteration to character at a site level. Okay, and so just in your view, would any sort of mitigation be able to overcome the your judgment of moderate adverse effect at year 10 or beyond? The mitigation helps in terms of reducing the visual effect, but it doesn't really help in terms of reducing the impact of building and car parking and such like within that area. The only thing you could maybe do is just dramatically reduce the extent of hard standing, but it remains the case that the development platform would have to be created in order to construct this building. Okay, thank you. And equally, in terms of your judgment at the LLCA 1 level, that the proposal would be moderate adverse in construction in year 1, and then reducing to slight after year 10. Could you just expand on your reasons for reaching that judgment, please? That's looking at it in a wider context, and so in the context of that landscape unit as a whole, I feel those changes, the importance of those changes are reduced. And why would that be the case? Just because you're looking at it. How do I explain? I suppose you're looking at it in relation to that landscape unit as a whole. So relatively speaking, it's a smaller proportion of the area that's going to be altered. So I'm looking at the balance of areas which will be retained and areas which will be affected, and it becomes a smaller percentage of the whole in the very simplest of terms. And what's your view in terms of the size of the site in relation to the size of the LLCA1 sort of unit, if you like? So what does it form a small, medium, or large proponent of the overall LLCA area? LLCA1 is shown on figure 6 of the appellant's figures in his proof of evidence. And it forms, well, his boundary doesn't have a boundary. Basically, it's drawn a circle, so it doesn't have an outer boundary. So it's a part. It's what percentages aren't a good way of dealing with these things, but it's it's a notable part of this area, given that this is perhaps the most rural part of an intact part of this landscape unit.
Okay, so it's a notable part of the landscape character unit.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the Mr. Villager's question about the landscape and visual, the review of the landscape and visual assessment, just a point of clarification, in the review document, do your colleagues make any specific recommendations as to whether planning application should be approved or refused?
No.
Okay, thank you. I think that covers my questions. Thank you, Miss Oxley. You may now relax.
Not totally.
Not totally. I'm just conscious of time. So, Mr. Robson, would you rather deal with re-examination before the break or and then the break?
I think so.
Do you think it will take long?
I don't think it will take very long, Ma'am. I have 3 points. You dealt with some of my points regarding the review, so we don't need to go back there necessarily. Ma'am, I'd rather do it now so that Ms. Oxley can then properly relax.
Yes.
When she gets a cup of tea and a biscuit.
Yeah, so I think that seems sensible approach. Mr. Robson, would you like to commence your re-examination?
Thank you. Ms. Oxley, you remember, we'll take it in reverse. You will remember you were asked a series of questions relating to the landscape master plan and the body of water, let's call it that neutrally. And it was put to you that you referred to it as a lake and that it was somewhat of an exaggeration. And your answer was, well, it's maybe 20 to 30 metres across originally, then maybe 20 to 25 metres across. And it's something between a pond and a lake. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Could you pull up document F10, please?
Yes, I have that.
And page 29, which is electronic page 52 on my copy.
Sorry, what page was that?
Sorry, ma'am. It's page 29 on the marked on the page itself, and page 52 of 181 on the electronic PDF.
Yes, I have that.
Are you there, ma'am?
Just about. My computer's running a bit slow. It seems to be overheating a bit. Just bear with me.
It's not the only one, ma'am. I hope you'll forgive me taking my jacket off without asking. There are building works going on near my house, and it's very hot in this room.
Ah, right. No worries.
Thank you. So I've had to keep the window closed. So page 29, page 51 electronically of the landscape character and capacity study, which we went through. You're there, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
And the first section, looking at the site description of EMP 5.1, on page 29 on the column on the right-hand side. it's talking about the characteristics of the area. So it says intensely farmed arable landscape, distinct rural character, views to the large woodlands around Brodsworth Hall and Melton Wood. And then on the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, starting on the 11th line down, it says there are no watercourses or ponds within the area.
Yes.
So lake or pond or somewhere in between. Is it or is it not a characteristic? Are those a characteristic feature of this particular area?
They're not a characteristic of this area. Indeed, on the page before, page 28, it says water is almost absent. So no, it's not a characteristic.
Thank you. You were asked a series of questions looking at the design comments. Do you recall that from this morning?
Yes.
And if you have the officer report, please, which is CDA6.
Yeah.
And on page electronic, an unpage numbered document. Tisk, page 18 of 33 electronically. There is the summary starting of the environmental.
It's that paragraph 9.98.
Sorry, no, I want to, so on page 18 of 33, 9.42, bold capital letters, says environmental sustainability.
Okay, yes.
Yes, and you'll see 9.43, the subheading landscape visual impact assessment. And then scroll down, the next subheading is agricultural land classification. And then 9.59, scrolling down, the subheading after that is design and appearance. And that includes a review of compliance with policy CS14. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So what are the differences in consideration between landscape and visual matters and, yes, to what extent are there differences between or similarities between the consideration of landscape and visual matters and design matters in the officer report? Well, let me rephrase the question. Are design and landscape treated separately or together?
They're treated separately because landscape has to consider fit and appropriateness for landscape and landscape impacts.
Whereas in your view, design is to consider
the qualities of the building itself, almost regardless of where it is.
Thank you. You were asked a series of questions this morning about the council's view on landscaping and whether or not you would agree with what was said at paragraph 9.100 of the officer report. It says, in conclusion, the environmental issue, and why you didn't include that first sentence about landscaping being overcome subject to suitably worded conditions. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I intervened to say I think your position was that you don't differ from that, but there's a difference in what landscaping can be interpreted as. Do you recall that part of this morning's exchange?
Yes.
Very good. If you scroll back, please, then to where we were earlier, so paragraph 9.52 this time. So 19 electronically. So this is within the environmental sustainability section and the subheading landscape and visual impact assessment. And then 9.52 states it is considered that the development will result in some harm to the character and appearance of the landscape. However, this is minor and significant weight is attached to this. However, given this is greenbelt, the second sentence, a matter for the planners in terms of weight. The first sentence, what is the conclusion of the officer report of the officer there?
That there'll be some harm to the character and appearance of the landscape.
And do you agree or disagree with that conclusion?
I agree with the conclusion.
Thank you. Could you now please turn up the C3, the LPA LVIA review, as it's titled, or the LUC LVIA review?
Yes, I have that.
Thank you. And if we go to the first page where it sets out the project number and the roles and responsibility of the roles of individual members of the LUC team. What was the role of Miss Crew, please?
She did the site work and part of the drafting.
And Miss McRae? Sorry, Mr. McRae, I think it was, wasn't it?
Mr. McRae did more of the drafting of the response.
And then above your name,
work.
And then above your name, it says approved. What was your role in this document?
Approving it, checking and approving.
Thank you. And it's over the page at 1.1. In answer to the inspector's questions, you said that no recommendations were made whether to approve or to refuse on landscape grounds. My learned friend spent quite a bit of time with you yesterday and again this morning on paragraph 1.1. Doncaster Metropolitan Borough Council are in receipt of 3 separate applications for crematoria as detailed in table 1.1. I don't think it's a matter of dispute, so hopefully I can lead on this. If not, I'm sure Mr. Village will intervene. But once a planning application has been received, the council has a statutory duty to determine it. That is its function in law. So they will necessarily have to determine the application. As part of their approach to determining the 3 applications, they've appointed LUC to carry out a review of the landscape and visual supporting material with each application. And then finally, this report provides a professional opinion on the robustness of the judgments made based on the experience of chartered members of the Landscape Institute. So properly looking at that first paragraph, what was the purpose of the LUC document?
Provide a professional opinion on robustness of judgment.
Thank you. Now, your proof of evidence, who wrote your proof of evidence?
Me.
And what was the purpose of your proof of evidence?
To provide my expert opinion on matters to this inquiry.
And which site or sites were you examining in your proof of evidence?
This one.
And which site or sites were being considered in the LUC review?
3 sites, including this one.
Thank you. So when the inspector wants your expert view of the landscape and visual effects of this scheme, should she look at the review document authored by your colleague and approved by you that reviews 3 appeal schemes, or your proof of evidence written by you looking in detail at this 1 scheme?
She should look at my proof of evidence.
Super, thank you very much. Those are my questions in re-examination. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you very much, Ms. Oxley.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robson, Ms. Oxley, and Mr. Village. Okay, I think now would be an appropriate time to take a break. So we shall adjourn the hearing until 11:30. 5:30, at which point we shall hear from Mr. Taylor. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We shall now resume the inquiry. Mr. Barrett, you may now call Mr. Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Mr. Taylor, can you have to your elbow your own proof of evidence, that of Mr. Kirkpatrick, and your own Appendix 3? For purposes of my examination in chief, we will look briefly at some of those documents.
Yes,
by turning to page 3 of your evidence, your qualifications and experience, and introduce you to the inquiry. You are Carl Taylor, is that correct?
it is.
You hold a Bachelor of Arts degree with honours in Landscape Architecture and a graduate diploma in Landscape Architecture. You're a member of the Landscape Institute and a chartered landscape architect. You've some 23 years experience as a practicing landscape architect in both the public and private organisations. And you've provided evidence at inquiry previously for local authorities, mineral authorities and private developers, assessing the impacts of a broad range of projects, including residential developments, wind farms, commercial development and biomass power generation. All that correct?
It is.
Yes, you're currently a director of TPM Landscape, a firm of chartered landscape architects, and you've experience in the field of landscape and visual assessment. And you tell us that in the next paragraph, a professional witness declaration, you are providing for the inquiry in recognition of your duty. You are providing an impartial professional view, irrespective of the party instructing you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I want to begin really with the approach that's been adopted to the work that you are submitting to this inquiry. Can I ask you to turn to scope of evidence, which is on page 5, about 1.7 onwards, and try and summarise this as succinctly as we can. You've looked at the landscape assessment work that was provided by the applicant appellant, including work by the local authority. You've taken account of available published studies in terms of landscape character and greenbelt in order to inform what you say at the end of 1.7, a rounded view of the potential impacts and effects of the proposal on the receiving landscape. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Right. And you also tell us that you've looked at visual proposal looking at a radius of about 1 kilometre from the appeal site.
Yes.
And you summarise 1.9, the key aspects of the planning background to the site and landscape related policies that you address. Is all that correct?
It is, and it's shifted slightly now, as I understand that very recently the local plan has been adopted. So there's I think I covered that as emerging policy, whereas now my understanding is that it's actually adopted policy, but yes, so correct.
Okay, now I want to turn to landscape character, and I think if you would be so good as to briefly explain what is the baseline against which the development proposal imposed upon that baseline will be.
Well, sorry, John.
I just wanted to understand whether the published landscape character assessment work has been consistent in its analysis of the landscape, including the appeal site.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mum, I've taken a fairly standard view, I think, in terms of how to approach it, and it's no different to what you'll see from the other expert witnesses. In terms of landscape, I've looked first at the national position, which is a limestone strip that runs north-south along the country within which this land sits. It's a large landscape character area, but it does offer some indications of the type of landscape that you find that then repeats in the other assessment work that followed. Following from that, typically be looking at regional or local landscape studies, which I did, and that's the C2 Southern Magnesium landscape type and areas. And then within, in this case, there's also a further sort of study piece of work. They're both described as landscape character and capacity, so they offer some informative into the capacity for different types of development, as well as a landscape character assessment, and that's the EMP 5.1, which is a smaller scale piece of the same landscape. They all describe what is a fairly, and I think it's been said by Miss Oxley, a fairly simple rural landscape. It has large, medium to large scale arable fields, wooded plantations, often open views to distance, but certainly an open rural feel. And it is in places crossed by transport corridors, and there is settlement as part of that, but certainly within the context of the local descriptions, they're all pretty consistent in what they describe as reasonably tranquil. The word tranquil is used in more than one occasion. Rural, arable, open landscape.
Do those landscape assessments also consider the general capacity for that landscape to receive development?
They do, in different forms. They look at housing, strategic employment. I think one of them also looks in a bit more detail at things like forestry and biomass. The ones that appear most relevant to this development that's in front of us, this appeal, I judge to be sort of housing and strategic employment, give you the clearest indication. I think forestry is also interesting in that even forestry was judged to be, I think, moderate. But generally for development, the indication is a capacity of low to none.
And then we've got to consider, as you consider in detail in your own evidence, what the impact of the proposal would be, the crematoria building and the associated roadways, parking areas and the like.
Yes.
Overview, please, of what the development will be in the context of this landscape.
Well, it's an introduction of urban development elements into what is currently a rural landscape, and it doesn't really have any clear association with any other urban or settlement elements. It's not adjoined to the settlement edge. It sits distinct within a field group which currently has no development on it at all. So from a landscape point of view, there's the physical change, introduction of buildings, car parking, road access, landscaping that associates with that, the activity that's associated with that, any lighting, which obviously over a site which is currently dark is associated with that development. All that points towards a notable change, and one which, in my view, alters the character of that landscape. In terms of physical elements that are lost, that's to a lesser degree. There's a hedgerow removal and then replacement. And I also take into consideration the fact that proposals do include the introduction of landscape planting elements with some benefits that they bring to a landscape. But essentially, when the landscape is at least partly defined by its simple, open, rural, tranquil nature, introducing any of these elements is, in my view, adverse and something which would be noticeable. Visually, less of an impact, in my opinion. You'll see from my proof that I consider a number of locations, and in my view, I have the same opinion as Miss Oxley in that it is a site which will be visible from locations around the local area, and it will lead to some lower level impacts, particularly after mitigation, but nevertheless it will still lead to adverse visual impacts.
Now I want to touch upon the Greenbelt. Can I ask you to turn up your Appendix 3, where you provide an extract? If one's looking at the PDF file of your Appendix 3, I believe it begins at page 39 and 43. It's towards the end. It's your Appendix 3 actually draws together the relevant sections from landscape character areas. E8 is the total document. I don't think we need to go to it. That's the Greenbelt analysis, is it not?
Is this, Mr. Barrett, the Greenbelt, the extract from the Greenbelt document, the Ardwick
Yes.
Street 5? Yes.
That's the one. I think
Yeah.
we can touch upon it because it's dealt with in your evidence more fully. But does Mr. Kirkpatrick refer to this document as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, no.
And what does it tell us? Well, first of all, let's get the status of the document. Is this part of the evidence base for the emerging local plan document?
Yes, my understanding was that it is part of that. And it might be of interest, Ma'am, to you that I think in Miss Ox's chief, you were taken to what is called document H13, which is a previous appeal decision, which is for land, or I guess it's a motorway service area, but it's the same landscape character area and it's the same area of Greenbelt. And that also references this document in terms of considering, broadly speaking, purposes of Greenbelt in this area. So it may be of interest to you.
Yes, and if you would be so kind, just to summarise, did it identify the purposes of the Greenbelt that this land served and
yes,
address those issues in the scoring system?
It goes through in a fairly sort of standard methodological way, considering each of the purposes in turn and how well the parcel, which is chosen here, or the area, Ardwick Street 5, serves the purposes. I think broadly speaking, it serves the purposes, I think 1, 2 and 5 well, and 3 gets a moderate score, which is encroachment. 4 is probably not of relevance to this particular piece of land or this particular appeal. But I think from my perspective, Ma'am, it identified and backed up the position of the landscape character assessment work that this is a landscape which is susceptible and vulnerable to change and has little capacity for development. And in terms of Greenbelt, little capacity to be able to take any development whatsoever without harm to not only openness but also purposes. And I think from my perspective, although I'm not sure I actually say it, it would seem that encroachment into countryside is perhaps the obvious element of the purposes that would be harmed by this, but also purpose 5, where I think the document identifies that this particular area is in a regeneration priority area, and therefore to direct development into Greenbelt here would be contrary to that. So both purpose 3 and purpose 5 appear to me to be probably the most relevant of the purposes harmed by the proposals in this case.
Okay, and now can I ask you to turn to Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence and turn to his paragraph 7.1.13. 7.1.13, because I'm trying to identify where are the professional differences in relation to judgment between you and Mr. Kirkpatrick on the issue of Greenbelt in particular.
I have it, yes.
I hope, ma'am, you've got it, Mr. Kirkpatrick. 7.1.13. The end of that paragraph, he's referring then to people attending well, I believe he's referring to people attending services, and he speaks of the opportunity will be therefore provided for people to experience the visual openness of the Greenbelt. That experience would be enhanced, he says. I'd just like you to, is that a view that you share, Mr. Taylor?
No, it's not. I find that a contrary argument. I don't think, to my mind, that although it's right that people will be able to access the land and walk over this landscape with the development in place, to be able to do that at all over a road, going to a building or in a car and parking a car, means that there has to follow harm to openness and harm to the Greenbelt. That's not enhancement, to my mind. That's a clear case of a physical intervention, which is inappropriate development and therefore must be a harm. And the idea that you can go and experience it because you've put the road there, and that means that the road is somehow not of relevance, or the building doesn't, to my mind, follow at all.
I'd just like you to explain your approach to the notion of openness, in particular the Greenbelt context. How would you express your approach to the issue of openness and the identification of it for the purposes of this appeal?
My understanding is that there's a spatial aspect to it, which is broadly understood as being without development, and within that there's also a visual aspect that can be considered. Somewhere within all of that also is because I think it's fairly standard that people have used and relied upon landscape and visual impact evidence to assist in the process of determining this, that landscape character assessment also plays a role, and landscape and visual are separate, but landscape assessment includes the idea of views and visual amenity too. But there's a distinction in my mind between a straight visual assessment in LVA, which is looking from particular points, receptors, people, and where they can see it from, and the concept of visual amenity more broadly in the terms of landscape character. So in terms of the landscape character in this site, we have open, rural, agricultural, arable fields, and it would be a change to that, but also obviously there's a visual aspect to that, particularly as this will be a public site. So as we just mentioned before, it's a site that you will be able to access, and the experience will be different. It will be permanently changed from something which was a fairly simple landscape and as part of a broader description to one which includes urbanizing elements. So sorry, just to sort of combine those two, really, the spatial aspect to my mind is a fairly straightforward one, in that this is a green belt without development, and it will then be, with this proposal, a green belt with development. So it's reasonably straightforward. Visually, from a receptive perspective, I think, as I said before, there will continue to be, even with mitigation, glimpsed views which will lead to some visual adverse harm from local receptors, albeit that will be at a fairly low level. But landscape character-wise, including the visual aspects more broadly, will also see harm to the landscape character, and so that all of those elements play into what I would suggest, Marm, is a sort of way in turn that you would look at understanding the effects on openness.
Now, can I actually just go back to your proof of evidence, turn to page 50, where you begin your summary and conclusion section. I think I can ask you to summarise this from 7.6. I'll ask you to read it quite frankly, 7.6 onwards to the conclusion, Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, the general capacity for development across all of the local landscape areas is low to none, with even forestry assessed as moderate. The quality of the landscape is described as high, but lower to the east of the A1. The proposed development will bring an urbanising character into one which is described clearly as a rural and tranquil landscape, with simple and clearly defined character elements of open rolling landform, large arable field systems, and woodland blocks and plantations. The landscape descriptions make a distinction between west and east of the A1M, noting that to the east, urban influences into this landscape have been more prolific, noting the mining at Brodsworth as an example. This industrial heritage, however, has shifted into a new phase of regeneration, and the landscape outside of the settlement edges are sparsely populated with only occasional small settlements and farmsteads. The appeal proposals would represent a large and uncharacteristic introduction to development into an otherwise rural setting. The introduction of hard landscaping, built form, car parking, access roads, lighting, and formal landscape areas will be strongly urbanising changes across an open and rural existing landscape with limited visual connections to any of the other nearby settlement areas. Physically, the appeal sites and the proposed areas of development are separate from the settlement edge to the east and connect only by way of Green Lane to the north to more urban features. The proposed development will bring adverse change to a settled agrarian landscape with limited urban influences and gradual receding influence from past industrial uses. I've considered the visual effects of the proposed development and recorded this to the 7 representative views from locations from up to 1 kilometre distance from the site. Of the 7 views assessed, the largest effects are receptors along Green Lane, where the introduction of the appeal proposals will be most noticeable, and the context will remain clearly development in open countryside, without any associated context with other visible development or urban form. The appellant's LVIA also highlights the potential for views from locations at greater distance than this to the west, but I agree with the appellant that the effects associated with this are likely to be low to negligible.
I think in paragraph 13 there's a typographical error on the 3rd line where it says see a change to. That might be see a change from, but I'll ask you to read 713, please, with that in mind.
Yes, no. Effects on views from Brodsworth Community Woodland will be limited to sections of the extensive footpath network. But as with the effects for Green Lane, these will see a change from tranquil and clear rural scene through the introduction of the 2 urbanising elements. I disagree with the overall assessment of effect the appellant describes within the LVA, but agree that the level of change from these receptors is likely to be low. The visual effects are in places reduced over time through mitigation responses, but post-mitigation views from Green Lane and the site itself will be permanently changed through the introduction of urbanising features into a landscape which, other than the highway network, is distinctly rural. The landscape of the appeal site has been assessed as part of a Greenbelt review by Doncaster Council, and the overall scoring of this review supports the retention of the Greenbelt in this area and suggests that the capacity for any development is low to none and will be harmful and detrimental. This further supports other landscape character assessment work done by Doncaster Council, which suggests a low capacity for development in the landscape of the appeal site. My own landscape assessment of the proposal, to some degree, the appellants confirms the landscape harm across the local landscape character areas that include the appeal site. Visually, there is limited harm, but the proposals will lead to adverse visual effects within the assessed landscape. There will clearly be an adverse landscape and visual effect over the Greenbelt, and this must have an adverse impact upon openness of the Greenbelt. The appeal site will go from an open field within a landscape described as distinct through characteristics that include a rural and tranquil agrarian landscape to one where built form, hard landscape areas, access roads, car parking, and formal landscape areas dominate. This will be a transformational change to the landscape character of the appeal site, the local landscape areas, and by association the Greenbelt, bringing in urbanisation to the land that is not connected physically or visually to any other congruous developments, elements or structures. It's my opinion, following the landscape assessment of the appeal proposals, that this will lead to significant harm to the Greenbelt and its openness. In this regard, my findings fully support the reasons for refusal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. I'm sure there'll be some questions of you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Village, you may now commence your cross-examination of Mr. Taylor.
Good morning.
Good morning,
Mr. Taylor. Can we start, please, by just looking at the issue of green belt policy that you refer to in your evidence, as we know, there are 5 purposes of including land in the green belt. Is this something that you're familiar with in your role as a landscape architect?
I think so. I have the NPPF in front of me, and I have the para 138, which I think you're referring to. Yeah.
And as I said, is it something you're familiar with?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And good, because you refer in your evidence to the green belt analysis, and you included in your appendices and the scoring that's given. And I think you, at paragraph 4.111, you take that up.
Yes.
You say the overall score for the area suggests the green belt in this location supports strongly the green purposes, the green belt purposes, I think it should say, 1, 2, and 5, and to a lesser extent purpose 3. Just to be clear, purpose 3 is to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, isn't it?
Yes.
And if we turn to the planning and policy matters statement of common ground, would you take that up? Do you have that?
I don't have it immediately. I'll have to find it. Is it a core document?
It is a core document. And I suspected that you weren't aware of it.
Well, it's a planning statement of common ground, so it wasn't anything that I spent a great deal of time on. I had a landscape statement of common ground to consider. So
yes, well, the reasons which will become apparent, I don't think that will help you, but it's to help you. It's document A8.
okay, I have it.
And if you turn to, and it's signed by Mr. Chris Mitra, who's on, I think, one of your colleagues from Memoria, yeah?
Yep.
And if you look at paragraph 1.5, it says this statement of common ground should be read alongside additional SOCGs that have been prepared and agreed on behalf of the appellant, the council, and the Rule 6 party in respect of need matters and landscape and visual matters, yes?
Yeah.
So we read this alongside your statement of common ground on landscape and visual matters, correct?
Yes, I think that's what it means.
And if we turn to paragraph 6, section 6, page 13, other matters of agreement, you see that?
What was the reference? Sorry, 6.
Section 6 on page 13.
Yep.
The following points are agreed. Roman 2, the development would conflict with the green belt purpose regarding encroachment.
Yes.
There are no other identified conflicts with the other purposes of the green belt, are there?
Not in that, no.
And indeed, matters of disagreement, there is no raising by either Memoria or the council of any other conflicts with the purposes of the green belt in the matters of disagreement, is there?
No, I think that's correct.
Yeah. So the position remains that and I should also add, by the way, if you turn back to page 14
Of the same document.
yes, of the SOCG on planning, it says in terms the development does not conflict with the following 4 purposes of the green belt as set out in para 138.
It does.
And it says checking the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, preventing neighbouring towns merging into one another, preserving the setting and special character of historic towns, and assisting in urban regeneration by encouraging the recycling of derelict and other urban land.
I think if it assists, in my chief, I may have suggested that there was an element of consideration that the inspector should take to purpose 5, but I can see that that has been considered, so I'm happy to go with what is in the statement of common ground.
So, I mean, I think in fairness, you're coming over, Mr. Taylor, if I may say so, as a fair man. You can withdraw those criticisms in relation to other purposes of the green belt, because it's a matter of agreement, isn't it, between the parties, that the only purpose that's engaged in this case is purpose C, encroachment.
I think, Ma'am, I was kind of generally explaining my approach to considering openness and greenbelt and purposes form part of the approach. Obviously, when you're looking at a greenbelt review, which has been done by the council, it's considering purposes as well as openness. I'm happy that you look at what's suggested in the statement common ground as issues of contention, and that's purpose 3. Yeah,
and sorry, just to but haven't answered my question. Withdraw your points in relation to the other purposes.
I think, Mum, I've, you know, without having to force me into some kind of humiliation position, I think I've made the position pretty clear, and that I would direct you, having been taken to the statement of common ground on planning, that you should consider purpose 3.
Yeah, Mr. Taylor, let me be clear. I'm not trying to humiliate you. All I'm trying to do is deal with some points that you've raised in your evidence in chief only a few moments ago, and indeed by way of criticism of my client's own landscape witness. And I'm just simply trying to be clear that as far as it is common ground between all parties, that the only issue of purpose is C in relation to encroachment into the countryside.
Yeah, I think I've been clear as that I agree with that.
Yeah, okay. And therefore you withdraw your comments in relation to the other purposes.
I think I've been clear as to exactly what I meant by that.
Well, why did you mention them then?
I think I've been clear as to how I've dealt with that matter.
Well, I'll just ask you again, why did you mention them if they're not relevant?
I did explain that as well, Ma'am. I think I explained that I was talking broadly as to how I approached the matter, and it's a consideration because it's part of the Green Belt review.
A consideration which, for the purposes of this case, is not relevant.
That's correct. I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Good. Now, Mr. Taylor, I'd like to ask you about some viewpoints, please. And for the purposes of this part of the cross-examination, I'd like you to turn to your page, your appendix 1, where you identify a number of viewpoints. The viewpoints themselves are set out on the very first page of appendix 1, and they are I think it's fair to say all taken from either Green Lane or north of Green Lane. I mean, viewpoint 5 is effectively on Green Lane, but within the site. Is that right?
Yes, actually, I think Green Lane, the viewpoint 5, actually, because I didn't access the site, I think that's kind of a printing error. Partly is that it was over. I think 5 is from a gap.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just to indicate that actually I stood up and went onto the top of the hedgerow. So yes, you're quite right. They are from Green Lane or north of Green Lane, and they're all fairly close to the site.
And those are all the viewpoints that you rely on, as far as I can see, but I may be mistaken.
No, that's true. I do comment on Brodsworth Hall. I take agreement with the landscape and visual assessment of the appellant, which appeared originally. But I don't make any further comment on that.
Well, that's very fair of you as well. Thank you very much. We know that you agree with that. But just on the question of the site itself, I mean, I asked my client whether or not you had requested to go onto the site for the purposes of presenting your evidence, and I didn't believe you made such a request, did you?
I didn't know.
So I think it follows from that you haven't actually been onto the appeal site at all, have you?
I've not walked physically onto it. I relied on the excellent photography that was done by the appellant, which takes views from a number of different locations on the site. Yeah. No, I didn't have permission to go onto the site.
Well, you didn't ask.
And for the purposes of this, there are no receptors currently on the site, and so this exercise is more about understanding views from receptors, public receptors.
Right.
It's a site that you can see. I think View 5 shows that by looking, if you get yourself into position over the hedgerow or Marm, when you go, you'll see there are gaps and field gates. You can see into the site very clearly. I mean, it's an open site. Once you get the other side of the hedgerow, it's an easy site to look over.
Yeah. Well, I think, as you say, once you get to the other side of the hedgerow, more is visible, but let's just see what we can see. And clearly, the inspector is going to be going onto the site, so she will be able to judge for herself in due course. But it's helpful to just try and identify, by reference to these viewpoints, what can and cannot be seen, and also your approach, just to test your own conclusions as to the effect. So let's go first to viewpoint 1, please, which is taken from within Brodsworth Community Woodland. And that, I think, is taken, well, it is obviously just taken just above the car park. I mean, there's a path which leads up from the car park to the to effectively the circular walkway right at the top, the circular footpath right at the top.
Yeah, you've got a link where you can either go, simply speaking, left or straight on. So this is the kind of beginning to go left along that route.
Yeah, good. And that, I think, we can compare with, if you turn up Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence, and I think want to look at the winter views that Mr. Kirkpatrick's produced, which I think are his Appendix B. Yeah. And we turn to photograph
N, photograph N.
Photograph N, thank you very much. So what we can see there is, first of all, the hedgerow along the western boundary. And it's fair to say that, in fact, in Mr. Kirkpatrick's photograph N, it's more elevated than your photograph, your viewpoint 1, isn't it?
Taken from a different location, I presume that's from slightly further along.
Slightly further along. It's a slightly more.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Village. Is that photograph M for mother or
No.
N for Norman? Just to clarify.
N Norman, November.
Thank you.
And so what one can see, so it's slightly elevated, slightly further to the west, I think, and I mean, I just so I am clear, what you're alleging is that you would be able to see vehicle movements from that location and glimpses of the building and car park areas are likely, you say, from this location. Lighting impacts will also be noticeable in what is currently a largely dark landscape. Now, just taking those points in turn, the vehicles in that location will in fact be behind that hedgerow that we can see in the distance, won't they?
Well, I think you're directing me towards the photograph N, whereas I've actually taken it from a slightly different location. It varies as you walk along that path. The one I've chosen to look from, you don't see that hedgerow in the same way, but you are looking over towards the corner of the woodland plantation where the building will be. So my view is that yes, you will get glimpses of movement and car parking and possibly the.
Well, I mean, as lawyers would say, a fortiori, if you can't see the hedgerow in your location. I mean, what my case is, you won't be able to see the cars because they're hidden by the hedgerow. In fact, in your location, the hedgerow, in fact, is hidden by intervening hedgerow along the main road, isn't it?
Well, because of the angle of view, you're actually looking sort of more directly into the site than you are from as you travel further west, because then the angle becomes more closer to a sort of 90-degree angle. So it's not helped by the fact that the views offered for the LVIA don't indicate where the proposal site is, nor do they indicate where any of the elements are or model any of the views. So my professional view, having been there on site, and Marm, you will do the same, is that you will get glimpses. I mean, if you look at view one, I've said low magnitude of change. I'm not making a big play of this. I just think you will get glimpses of development. It's a reasonably large development. It's got buildings, it's got movement, activity, lighting at this time of year that will be evident. My opinion was that you would get glimpses of that regardless of the existing hedgerow.
Well, I just want to unpack that because, first of all, in your viewpoints, and these are obviously viewpoints chosen by you, and so we can assume that you're putting your best foot forward in terms of the effect or the impact of the development. In that viewpoint, you don't see the entrance off the main road, off Green Lane, do you?
It's hard to say because it's not marked on site in any way. I would say that it's probably just out of view, but only just.
Yeah.
And there is a removal of hedgerow, so it's. I was unclear as to whether there's an element of the removal of hedgerow you might see from that location. But as I say, it's a representative view of a number of positions along that. Mr. Kirkpatrick has another one in photograph N, where you look across to the site boundary, in my view, as well, slightly into the site. So.
Yeah. So we'll come on to Mr. Kirkpatrick. So I'm just looking at, you see, the principal point I had here, Mr. Taylor, for you, is that you wouldn't in fact see the cars in this location, this viewpoint, because they would be hidden behind the hedgerow, which marks the western boundary of the site.
Well, like as I said before, I think from my view, then the angle is different. So you're looking because the topography drops, so you look over that hedgerow in places. So from my view, you would still get glimpses of that. There's also car parking as well in that field, further down, and the elevation of vehicles obviously is something. It's not modelled, so you have to make a judgment as to whether, when you're looking at that, and you add 2 meters on for a vehicle, whether that's then visible.
Well, you add you
meters.
So you are aware that there's a proposal to increase the height of the hedgerow on the western boundary.
I can see that the mitigation proposals include for a number of things, including additional planting along that boundary.
Not just additional planting, but allowing the hedgerow to grow.
I'll take that as a statement of truth.
And what we can also note, by reference to the topography maps, landform plans and so on, which are before the inquiry, that on the other side of the access road is on the other side of that hedgerow, correct?
Yes.
And therefore the vehicles will be hidden behind that hedgerow.
Well, as I said, I don't think when we're talking about vehicles moving down across that landscape, moving across from the entrance, parking down the bottom, my view wasn't that when I was looking at it. Marm, you will have the opportunity to go and make the same judgment. You're not assisted in any way from the appellant by actually offering up any modelled evidence on this. So my professional view is that it will still be, particularly, I mean, this is all sort of, I still take the view that you will get glimpses, but at this time of year, you will get headlights, you will get lighting from the building. So those are all visual things that a hedgerow and tree planting can't remove.
If you'd been on site yourself, Mr. Taylor, you would know that hedgerow runs all the way down to the plantation, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it does.
Yeah.
Photographs.
But in that photograph that we can see as a photograph N, I mean, the hedgerow is not visible in your viewpoint 1 because that's to say the western hedgerow is not visible because it's hidden behind the Green Lane hedgerow. But just taking the hedgerow in photograph N, we can see that in fact it tails off in that photograph. It effectively goes behind the landform, doesn't it?
Well, it appears to do.
Yeah.
I was just looking to see whether there was another view that actually showed it from the site, but I don't think there is.
Because we can see from, and you'll see it on site, the hedgerow runs the entire length from Green Lane down to Stane Hill Plantation. But in this photograph, it effectively it falls away behind the landform. And why would that be, Mr. Taylor?
Why would what be, sorry?
Why would it fall away behind the landform? What's the reason for that?
It follows the topography.
Exactly. So the topography is falling away as one goes into the site, and the building and the car parking are all, and one can see this from a number of plans, but I mean, for example, if you turn to the landscape master plan as Appendix F of Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence, you can see that the building is hidden behind Stane Hill Plantation, isn't it?
The building, yes.
And the car parking is hidden behind Stane Hill Plantation at a lower level where the topography falls away. You can see the contour. The contours are imposed on the landscape master plan, and the contours are at a lower level. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it is at a lower level. Yes, that's
and that's I suppose you'd probably agree why this was described as nestling in the existing landform in the report committee.
Well, it wasn't my description, so yeah.
Oh, but I mean, it's a fair description.
Fact, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's a statement of fact, as you say, nestling. Okay. Okay.
Well, the fact that somebody described it that way is a statement of fact. It's not my description.
Well, it's an accurate description, Mr. Taylor, isn't it?
No, it would be language that I'd use because it would be inconsistent with my view that this is an introduction of urbanising elements. So it wouldn't be the language I'd use.
Well, I'm not interested in that different point. I'm just interested in where, in how the building and the car parking sit in the landform.
Well, I think, I mean, I've got it in front of me now. It took me a while to get it.
Hang on. How they sit in the landform, and what's clear, looking at the master plan and the contours, is that they sit at a lower level, don't they?
They do sit at a lower level, yes.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the plan now, and Ma'am, I'm sure you're looking at the same plan as I am. The car parking arcs out to the east to a significant degree, and then you have a series of memorial gardens which begin to sort of travel up the hill. So that goes past what I would consider any area that is protected or visually screened by the woodland block. So as I said before, from the location that I took, it felt that you were looking at the corner of that woodland block down the slope, and I agree, it's at the lower level, into an area which has a large area of car parking, a building which probably remains screened, but it's still, you know, down there, road access, and vehicle movements. And it's still my view that glimpsed movements and light will be visible.
Yeah. Going back to photograph N, Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence, and looking at that hedgerow, so we've agreed that hedgerow runs along the entire length of the from Green Lane to Stainhill Plantation. We can also see that the hedgerow falls away in view because, as you say, that's a feature of the existing topography. It must follow, I mean, simply, as night follows day, that if you can't see the hedgerow in that location, which we can't, then anything at a lower level than the hedgerow, so for example the car parking area and the memorial gardens, would not be visible either, would it?
Well, it depends on whether it's larger than the hedgerow. And I'm just looking at I've got the aerial photograph in front of me now, and that hedgerow does run all the way down, but it's quite gappy in places. I mean, again, the inspector, Ma'am, you'll walk the site, you'll be able to have a look at this. So I'm not persuaded to change my view, I'm afraid. I think if we're focusing on view one still, that's still what I think.
No, well, I'm not going to seek to persuade someone who has an intractable view which will not change come what may, whatever the evidence. All I'm interested in identifying features which show that your view must be wrong.
Okay.
And
I disagree.
And looking at photograph N, you refer to the hedgerow being gappy in places. It may or may not be gappy. In fact, it's proposed to enhance it and to fill it and to let it grow. But in this location, looking towards the car parking or looking towards the area between the hedgerow and Stainhill Plantation, behind that, whether it's gappy or not, if you can't see the hedgerow, you're not going to be able to see anything which is at a lower level than the hedgerow, are you? Well,
if the 2 points really, if the hedgerow's not there to be seen, then that's not a point that you can run with. But if it is, it means that anything the same height as the hedgerow at that particular location, no. But as I said before, I mean, I still think that there will be glimpses of movement, but even taking that out of the equation, lighting effects will be visible.
And we can see from the landscape master plan that the car parking and the building and indeed the memorial gardens are all at on a lower contour than the hedgerow which ceases to be visible?
I'm just trying to find that document again. Quite a lot of documents open. More or less, that's true. Yes, I mean, I think they begin at about the same level, actually, don't they, as the hedgerow finishes.
Okay. Okay. So anyway, so going back then to your viewpoint one, it's your serious contention that you will be able to see vehicles and also the building and the car park from that location. And
yeah,
is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Well, I have to say that we can't see how that arises for a moment in that location. And we note that you ascribe it moderate adverse views, but for the reasons I've just been through, simply can't be right. Right, well, let's go on then to, I think we can leave aside viewpoint 2 because you described that as negligible. Frankly, whether it's negligible or non-existent, I think you could probably just try and move on a little bit more quickly. I think the next one I want to ask you about yeah, I mean, I think the same point arises in relation to viewpoint 3, because that's more or less the same viewpoint as again photograph N, and photograph N is taken in the winter months, and
as I described before, it's not the same. There are two kind of different path directions that you can take from the car park, one travelling north, one travelling west. So this one's from the one travelling north, and it's at a higher location.
Well,
it's on a different path route.
Yeah, it's slightly higher. We can't actually even see the hedgerow in that location. So, I mean, the points I've already made will apply mutatis mutandis to that. Appendix 4, viewpoint 4 rather, and this is actually a viewpoint of what you say is the access, and you say the access proposals for the appeal site will open up the view to the south, removing hedgerow over section, creating a route into the site. The access road will be visible with the buildings and infrastructure also likely to be seen for a short section of the road. In terms of the view of the access road, obviously the access itself into the site would be visible, but the access road going down to the crematorium would not be visible after the reinstatement of roadside hedgerow, would it?
Well, there'll still be a gap. I mean, there is a turn in the road, but you're open, creating a road access with visibility displays into the site. So I can't see how it's possible to do that without having some views into the site.
Well, I think the point must be that the extent of views into the site are on any basis confined to where there is actually or will be a gap in the hedgerow to allow the access into the site. But but even in that location, as we see from the master plan, which is let's go back to that in the access road as one goes in turns sharply right, and one will not see the right out if one's looking it straight into the site, when one won't see the access road going straight down into the site, because it turns right. And what one will see, in fact, is that there will be planting which has been proposed, and some fairly heavy planting at that, on that, effectively that dog leg, which will be a screen into the site. So you see that the road goes down, obviously falling away there, but it's going to be screened by that planting, isn't it?
Well, I think there are a number of points on that. I mean, in terms of how I've assessed it, you're going from a position where you've got a rural lane with hedgerow, and the change will be that there's an opening into that with displays. There will be replacement hedgerow, but there'll be an access route, a road into that, presumably signage, possibly lighting. I don't know that the details are there for that. And then, Mum, if you look at my view 5, the two things from that, actually, I've realised that I actually took a photograph that picks up that boundary hedge we were talking about. So you can see